I'm Damian Ward, Professor of Business Economics and Dean of the Hertfordshire Business School. I'm going to talk about the UK economy as we move through the COVID-19 pandemic. A common focus of economic policy in the UK for many years has been on the importance of productivity, innovation and the skills to achieve that. And that happens nationally and regionally and is probably best exemplified by the industrial strategy which was applied to the UK a couple of years ago. Now, what I'm going to show today and raise as an alternative point of focus is that of resilience. That's not to discount the importance of productivity, but it's just to highlight how important resilience might be. Now, at one level you may say resilience is an obvious feature to focus on given the impact of the pandemic on the economy, but what I will hopefully show you is it's a fairly common observation over 40 years that major economic impacts occur in the UK, and therefore an interesting question to ask is, rather than focusing upon innovation and productivity, is should we be beginning to focus on the importance of resilience and the ability of companies inside the economy to fit with the turbulent economic environment which we appear to have. If we look at data for UK GDP from the start of the millennium, then within that we can see two significant events. First was the financial crisis of 2008-2009, where we can see a drop-off in GDP, and then we can see the current events around the pandemic, where the ONS has estimated there's been quite a substantial drop in GDP of around 20%. We can put some question marks against that initial estimate. First one is there is the first estimate by the ONS, and the ONS will be revising that figure over the next 3 years. In fact, it will do it each quarter, meaning there will be 12 revisions. At the point in which it measures GDP for the first time, the ONS generally collects about 25% of all the data it will need to get to its most accurate estimate. And during the pandemic, quite obviously the ONS has even found it more difficult to collect data because those companies involved in the sample may have been shut down. So that's the first question mark against the accuracy of the data. The second one, in sort of understanding the severity of it, is, well, to what extent will the economy bounce back? Some people are talking about a V-shaped recession and some people are talking about a U-shaped. So if there's lots of pent-up demand in the economy, and once we begin to really reduce the constraints on the economy and people's ability to work and spend, then we may see the economy bounce back very quickly, and we may get back to a point some people are suggesting of about an 8 or 10% reduction in GDP by the end of the year. But if I was to look at this data in a different way, and I was to look at trajectories, then I might highlight the following. If we look at the trajectory that the UK economy was on before the financial crisis, then casting that line forward, we can see that the UK economy in 2008 was on a track to get to about £2.4 trillion worth of GDP by today, by 2020. The impact of the financial crisis was to shift the UK economy to a new trajectory. And in looking at that second trajectory after 2009, we can see that the impact of the financial crisis was to delay our arrival at £2.4 trillion worth of GDP by about 5 years. If we then begin to think about, well, what has the pandemic done to our trajectory, and again allowing perhaps that the initial estimate for GDP is slightly pessimistic, we can draw in a new trajectory for the economy, and we'll see now that on some sort of reasonable assumptions that the UK economy is now not likely to arrive at £2.4 worth or £2.4 trillion worth of GDP until 2030. So we're not just thinking about the impact of the pandemic on the economy, and we're not just thinking about the impact of the financial crisis on the economy. In this analysis here, we're looking at the compound effect. And the effect of both of those catastrophes on GDP and calamities, is that our arrival at £2.4 trillion worth of GDP has been postponed by 10 years. That's 10 years in which we've had lower wages, lower profits, and lower wealth. Now, if we were to be thinking about productivity and innovation, that is an analysis which focuses on the slope of these lines, how fast the economy is growing. But what I would highlight to you here, I think what is observable here is the prosperous growth for the economy is not only linked to how fast we are growing and how more productive we become each year, but it's actually impacted quite substantially by the number of reductions in GDP and the impact of these enormous events like the financial crisis and indeed like the pandemic. And so our focus arguably could be moved away from productivity and innovation towards being more resilient and able to bounce back after a recessionary impact. If we cast back over time and look at the economic performance of the UK economy, then for the last 4 decades it's possible to see that there's nothing more predictable than an economic catastrophe. The current time we're looking at the impact of the COVID pandemic on the economy. Go back a decade, 2008, we can see the substantial impact of the financial crisis on GDP growth rates. Go back 2 decades actually to the beginning of the early 90s, and there was John Major in power, and he was trying to reduce inflation in the UK economy following a very expansionary period in the late 1980s. Go back to the beginning of the 1980s, the Thatcher government was in its first term in power, and there were huge cuts to the UK economy, which brought about 3 million unemployed. Go back almost a decade before that to 1973, and we also see the impact of the oil price crisis on the UK economy and indeed on many economies around the world. So stability in the free market era of the UK economy from the late 70s onwards, stability has been absent, and huge volatility, enormous economic crises, deep recessions actually have been a predictable, I would say, if not persistent feature of the UK economy. And that recognition is what drives my thinking about how businesses should be prepared to survive in that type of context. Is it a focus on productivity and innovation, which undoubtedly is a beneficial feature and has allowed companies to be competitive, innovative, and survive by bringing new products and features to the marketplace? But set against a background where economic recessions and the severity of them is so strong that it threatens the existence of businesses. Resilience strikes me as being a feature that is far more important to the long-term performance and survival of that company and indeed the economy than productivity and innovation may be. Productivity has been a central concern since the Industrial Revolution. Here we have an early drawing of Saltaire Mill, and within the mill and many other mills there was a focus on task specialisation, something Adam Smith had identified quite early on in 1776. And under task specialisation, when you bring workers together, what you're attempting to do is to boost overall productivity by getting each worker to concentrate on what they're particularly good at. And that was exemplified perhaps most famously by Henry Ford and the production of the Model T car about 100 years later. So that's what was going on in the factory setup, and it was an early form of what economists refer to as agglomeration. It's where you lump together complementary skills and services and expertise in order to be more productive. And we actually see that in the modern corporation as well. You put together accountants, marketeers, lawyers, IT specialists, technical experts in whatever the company is trying to produce, and you locate them inside the same building in order to be productive. And perhaps the pandemic has shown us that no longer is the most necessary way of achieving high productivity, because despite the pandemic and despite us locking the majority of the population in their homes, we've still quite surprisingly managed to produce 80% of GDP. Moving a layer above the factory, and what's particularly interesting about Saltaire as a model of productivity was the owner of this mill was quite visionary, and he located the mill within its own town and village. So he built around it supporting infrastructure that was important. So in the foreground of the picture here, you can just make out the train line. And actually less easy to see, but in the background of the picture, there's the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, which went almost through the middle of the mill. So the mill was embedded within key transport infrastructure. The mill owner also built all the houses to ensure that they were of a sufficient standard and sanitary to make sure all his workers were well and fit to come to work. He built a park for their leisure time. He built a college and a library for study, and he built a church for study. So for worship. So all around this mill, there was supporting infrastructure, agglomeration, related complementary activities which were going to overall support the productivity of this mill. And in the modern economy, we often highlight the London financial district as a world-leading centre of banking, and in part that's driven forward by having a good number of UK banks that know how to compete in a global market for finance. But at the same time, that centre of finance in London is supported by agglomeration effects. We don't just have world-leading banks, we also have world-leading legal companies. And in an industry where the transfer of credit, financial capital, from a lender to a borrower is crucially supported by the exchange of a contract, then you need world-leading lawyers to build contracts which reflect the innovations within the finance sector and support an ever-expanding credit creation process. Equally, those legal firms are supported by well-functioning law courts, English being well understood throughout the world. Put all that together and you've got a high degree of confidence amongst lenders and borrowers, which facilitates London's ability to be at the leading edge of financial services industry. And at the same time, we might just stretch that out a little bit and go, quite interesting to note that the London School of Economics is a world leader in financial research, so is Imperial College, so is UCL, so is King's College, and so is Cass Business School. So in and around the banks of London, we have the formation of new intellect, new research, and a thriving skills base for labour to go and work in there. And throughout the world, those notions of agglomeration have perhaps been pushed forward most recently by Michael Porter of the Harvard Business School. And he's advocated that international competitiveness and the creation of wealth within economies is deeply entwined and connected to the ability of industries to be innovative and to be productive and to create wealth through the exploitation of agglomeration effects. Now, I'm not disputing that, but what I am saying is that ability to drive forward productivity, which we can see on the trajectories of GDP, is in the modern economy repeatedly damaged. repeatedly impacted by the recessions which we appear to be having. And those recessions have been a very common feature for 4 decades. And therefore, I am highlighting what should we be particularly good at in order to take best advantage of any productivity gains that we're able to achieve in our economy. And that's why I'm particularly interested in looking at resilience. So what might a focus on resilience look like? Well, here I've got a picture of baobab trees in Africa. These can live for up to 6,000 years, and within them they have the ability to store thousands of litres of water and withstand a decade-long drought. If we want an example of one of the most resilient plants on Earth, this could be it. This is clearly not a plant which is built for performance. This is not a plant which has evolved to be the most productive plant on the planet. This actually is a plant which has evolved to be resilient. It is able to demonstrate longevity by adapting to the environment in which it finds itself. When we begin to think about business, and we begin to think about the way in which we are driven, governed, managed, and led, one of the interesting observations in the financial accounts is, or indeed in the annual reports, is that they're focused around the finances. And they're often focused around the profit and loss statement for a company. And in doing that, the eye of the reader and the eye of managers is drawn to a snapshot, indeed short-term performance measurement of a company on the 31st of the relevant month in the relevant year. That's how much profit was made by that company. And indeed, when you turn to the next page and you look at the balance sheet, those were the stated assets and losses of that company on that given day. One of the more important parts of the financial report, one which shows you a more dynamic flow of funds through the business, is its cash flow statement, which comes much later in the financial report than the snapshot financial profit and loss and the balance sheet. In compiling those reports, the auditors are required to sign off the business as a going concern, which simply means it has the available assets to meet its immediate liabilities. That's not a measure of resilience. Resilience is a longer term horizon over which the business needs to perform and survive. And in taking that longer term horizon, we begin to think about the issues, the risks, and the interplay with the broader sector, economy, society, and environment within which that business and that institute reside. An interesting proposal put forward after the financial crisis and adopted quite widely in South Africa under the King Code of Governance is the notion of integrated reporting. And within integrated reporting, the requirement is that a business needs to think more holistically in communicating the position of the business when the accounts are drawn up. So it's accepted that you need to have a snapshot approach to the finances. What's the profit and loss? There's a period of analysis during which we want to know how the business has performed. It's accepted that there is a snapshot of the balance sheet and indeed a snapshot of the cash flow. But what's brought more to the fore in integrated reporting is the requirement that's placed on the business to think about its stated strategy and its objectives. Where does the business wish to be in that 5 to 10 year event horizon? What are the risks that would derail the business from getting to those goals? What actions is it taking today in order to mitigate those risks? What actions is it taking to engage its stakeholders? What actions does it think is coming, or risks are coming from society? What actions and risks are coming from the environment? What actions and risks are coming from its competitive marketplace that it's in? Once you begin to ask management to take an integrated reporting approach, once you ask the board of directors and the governors to put in place a governance system which is focused on the longer term risks, then I think you begin to drive a mentality and a perspective which is focused on resilience and is less focused upon immediate short-term performance. And as I've said throughout the presentation, I'm not against the notion that productivity and innovation are important in driving forward a prosperous economy. What I'm observing is the economic environment in which we find ourselves is very, very turbulent. And the bigger risk to our prosperous economy has been the inability to be resilient rather than the inability to be productive. And I think the pandemic brings all of that into sharp relief. And it's an obvious thing to say when challenged by a pandemic that we need to be more resilient. But I think I've shown that if you cast back over 40 years, whilst the pandemic is an unprecedented negative impact on all of us and on the economy, there have been substantial negative impacts throughout that 40-year period. And businesses that are prepared for that, businesses that hold the reserves of water, like these trees, to go through those periods of drought, are going to strengthen the economy, our lives and our jobs. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope you find those ideas provoking and food for thought.